Welcome to our presentation on celiac disease and chronic digestive issues from a Germanic New Medicine perspective. We are very grateful to the Global GHK group for inviting us to speak as they celebrate their 9th year as a global community. Today we will discuss what celiac disease is and how it is understood in conventional Western medicine, how celiac disease and digestive issues are typically diagnosed and managed, how the lens of Germanic New Medicine can be applied to these conditions, including the role of conflicts, tracts, and biological programs, and how this knowledge may support you in working with your body, reducing fear, and opening possibilities beyond a fixed lifelong diagnosis. Join us as we weave personal stories and practical tools so you can begin to understand your symptoms, not as malfunctions in the body, but as meaningful responses that can be understood and gently guided toward healing. As a reminder, the information presented in this course is intended for educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. While concepts such as Germanic New Medicine, holistic biology, and natural living approaches are discussed, these are offered as perspectives for learning and self-reflection, not as medical directives. Participants are encouraged to use their own discernment, consult qualified healthcare professionals for any medical concerns, and take full responsibility for their personal choices and well-being. Neither of the presenters shall be held liable for any misuse of the material, misinterpretation, or application of the information provided.
Myself and Julie are both passionate educators of Germanic healing knowledge, with a special focus on celiac disease and chronic digestive symptoms. We each arrived at this work through our own digestive struggles and realization that bloating, pain, diarrhea, and intolerances are not mistakes, but meaningful biological responses to emotional conflicts. According to conventional medicine, celiac disease is a chronic autoimmune disorder that occurs in genetically predisposed people, where eating gluten, a protein in wheat, barley, and rye, triggers the immune system to attack the lining of the small intestine. This damages the tiny finger-like villi that normally absorb nutrients, leading to poor nutrient uptake and possible deficiencies in iron, B vitamins, vitamin D, and more. Symptoms can look very different from person to person. Some have digestive issues like diarrhea, bloating, abdominal pain, and weight loss, while others mainly experience fatigue, anemia, bone weakness, headaches, skin rashes, mood changes, or fertility problems. It's estimated that 1 in 100 people may have celiac disease, but many remain undiagnosed because the picture can be so varied. From this perspective, diagnosis is usually based on blood tests for specific antibodies, sometimes genetic tests, and often an intestinal biopsy via endoscopy to confirm damage to the villi. Testing is ideally done while the person is still eating gluten, because removing gluten too early can make the results appear normal. Treatment is considered simple in theory, but demanding in daily life. A strict lifelong gluten-free diet. This means completely avoiding wheat, barley, rye, and all hidden sources of gluten in processed foods, sauces, medications, supplements, and even some cosmetics. Conventional medicine teaches that even tiny amounts of gluten, such as crumbs or cross-contamination in the kitchen, can trigger immune reaction again. There is no cure in this model, only ongoing management through total avoidance of gluten, so the intestine can heal and further damage can be prevented.
My story is really a story of how emotional awareness can soften the body and change the way it responds. For more than 30 years, I lived with a confirmed diagnosis of celiac disease. I followed all the rules. I avoided gluten completely, watched every label, worried about crumbs on cutting boards and cross contamination. I built my life around the belief that my body simply could not handle gluten and that this was something I would live with for the rest of my life. Over time, though, I started to feel that there had to be more to the story. That search led me to Germanic New Medicine and the BioSwitch program. Through this work, I was introduced to the idea that what we call a disease can actually be a meaningful, special biological program, an intelligent response of the body to an unexpected emotional shock, what GHK calls a DHS, a moment that feels sudden, dramatic, and isolating. When I first heard Dr. Hammer's story and his discoveries, something in me lit up. If the body is not attacking itself, if it is actually trying to help us adapt to something overwhelming, then what was my celiac diagnosis really about? How could I have spent decades believing that my immune system was my enemy, if in reality it might have been trying to protect me? As I studied GHK further and worked with the BioSwitch process, I began to look at my symptoms through a different lens. GHK suggests that what we often call gluten intolerance can be related to a morsel conflict, a difficulty taking in, digesting, or accepting a morsel, whether that is food or a painful reality or experience in life. When I gently traced my own timeline, I saw something I had never fully connected before. My digestive symptoms began right after one of the most heartbreaking moments of my life, the sudden death of my brother. At that time, I recall being obsessed with fettuccine alfredo. From a GHK perspective, the shock of losing my brother, combined with the emotional comfort I attached to my love for fettuccine, created a deep imprint in my psyche. Gluten became a track for the trauma. Every time I encountered it, my biology remembered the loss, the emptiness, the feeling of being starved for my brother's love. On a deeper level, my body was saying, "This is something I cannot digest." Dr. Hammer's observation of psyche, brain, and organ helped me understand that my intestines were not defective. They were carrying out a protective program that had been switched on in a moment of unbearable grief. When I made the connection between my brother's death, my love for fettuccine, and the symptoms that came afterward, something inside me softened. My nervous system stopped seeing gluten as a symbol of danger and loss. Dr. Hammer refers to this moment like a stone falling from the soul. With time and through the BioSwitch process of consciously revisiting and resolving the original shock, I began to feel safer in my body. The intensity of my symptoms faded. I slowly started to reintroduce gluten very gently, listening closely to how my body responded. To my surprise, the old dramatic reactions did not arrive in the same way. The pattern that had shaped so much of my life began to lose its hold. In that process, I realized I didn't have to live under the weight of the celiac label any longer. For many years, decades, it felt like a defining part of who I was. Through the lens of GHK, I began to see my body as wise, responsive, and deeply protective, not broken or against me. This is the story I share now, It is not medical advice. It is a lived experience. It is a gentle invitation to consider that when we understand the emotional roots of our conflicts, we may discover new possibilities for healing that we never knew were there. It's important to understand that the subconscious mind will store everything the psyche is able to pick up at the time of the conflict shock. A person could be drinking a coffee, eating a sandwich, driving in a red car. In my case study, I happened to be obsessed with fettuccine, and gluten became a track or reminder, a trigger for me. Every time I would eat gluten, my subconscious would signal, warning, last time you were eating this, you experienced a conflict shock. I'm going to run this program again to help you digest what you weren't able to digest when you had your original DHS. The psyche stores the memory until you resolve the conflict. Again, Dr. Hammer refers to these kinds of unexpected traumatic experiences as a biological conflict shock. It triggers a psychological response in your body to help you overcome that unexpected trauma that one can experience. When we go through a traumatic experience that is acute, unexpected, and isolative, our subconscious mind stores tracks or reminders of that experience. This is essentially an early warning signal so that if we find ourselves in a similar situation again, our subconscious re-triggers that program in order to prepare us for dealing with a reoccurrence of that experience. According to Dr. Hammer, this is the root cause of chronic illness. In my case, every time I would eat gluten, I was reminded of the starvation of my brother's love. Whether it is a specific food, dairy product, traumatic experience, environmental allergen, or an emotion, every time a person encounters their DHS, their condition will be triggered once again. This is also why it is important that we resolve our conflicts rather than suppress them. Nature never lets us forget.
I grew up in Africa, held between two very different worlds. Outside there was sunshine and the amazing wilderness, a feeling of freedom. We had a wonderful, adventurous life. However, at times, especially on weekends when my dad drank alcohol, the energy at home would become unpredictable, where a quiet evening could turn into raised voices, sharp comments, or heavy silence. Oftentimes, there was a lot of physical and emotional tension involved. My body reacted long before I understood any of this. As a child and teenager, and even into my adult years, I had ongoing gas, bloating, constipation, and abdominal pain. By the end of the day, my belly often felt swollen and hard. I held back feelings, just as my intestines seemed to be holding everything inside. Looking back now through the lens of GHK, I can see that my tracks were not just food. They were alcohol, fights, criticism, and even the news. Growing up in Africa, there was also a lot of talk about war and danger and politics. The news and adult conversations were often full of fear and anger. As a child, I did not know how to digest all of this. I took it in, but I could not express it. This is known as an indigestible morsel conflict. The morsel for me was the emotional atmosphere around alcohol, fighting, criticism, and stories of war. My intestines were trying to process what my heart and voice could not. Every time I heard raised voices, saw an angry face, smelled alcohol, saw someone drunk, or listened to frightening news, my body reacted as if the original conflict was happening again. They were my tracks. Understanding this brought me a lot of compassion for my younger self. My gut was not failing. It was protecting me in the only way it knew how. As I began to work with these old patterns, by creating more safety in my present life, setting boundaries, and choosing calmer environments whenever possible. I also practiced softening my body when old tracts appeared by slow breathing, placing my hand on my belly, reminding myself this is an old memory. I am safe now. Little by little, as I honored my story and changed how I responded to those triggers, my nervous system begins to relax. My gut no longer had to carry the same burden, that fear. According to Dr. Hammer, there are 5 biological laws that describe the course and progression of almost all diseases. We will focus solely on the first biological law. According to Dr. Hammer, what we call disease is not the body breaking down or making a mistake. It is the beginning of a meaningful biological response. His first biological law, as we have discussed, explains how this response starts with a very specific kind of shock, which he called a DHS, or a Dirk-Hammer syndrome, named after his son Dirk. This is not just ordinary stress. A DHS is an event that feels sudden, deeply emotional, and isolating, the kind of moment where you feel overwhelmed and alone with what just happened. In that instant, the experience is said to imprint on all 3 levels at the same time. It affects how you feel and perceive the situation, which is the psyche. It shows up in the specific area of the brain, and it also corresponds to a particular organ or a tissue in the body. From a GHK perspective, this is the moment when a special biological program switches on. The program is not seen as arbitrary or malicious, but as the body's way of adapting to what the person could not fully process at that particular moment. Dr. Hammer described that when this shock occurs, a ring-shaped pattern appears in the related brain relay. On a non-contrast CT scan, it looks like a target with circular rings, and he calls this a Hammer focus. The position of that focus is interpreted as giving information about what type of conflict was experienced, such as a morsel conflict or a territorial conflict, and which organ is involved. He also paid attention to how the Hammer foci looked. If the rings appear sharp and clearly defined, he interpreted that as a sign that the conflict is still active, that the person has not yet resolved what happened. If the rings appeared more blurred or fuzzy, he saw that as a sign that the conflict has been resolved and the body is now moving through a healing phase. In simple terms, the first biological law suggests that so-called disease begins with an event or a situation that we have not fully digested or resolved. That unresolved experience is mirrored on the 3 levels of the psyche, brain, and organ. Smaller conflicts may show up as what we label as minor conditions. A very intense shock may show up as a more serious illness. This is the framework that later allowed ourselves to look at the celiac diagnosis through a completely different lens, seeing it not as a lifelong defect, but as a meaningful biological program that began in the moment of the deep emotional shock and continued until that conflict was finally understood and resolved.
The small intestine is linked to what is called an indigestible morsel conflict. This is any experience that feels hard to take in, difficult to accept, or hard to process. It may be literal, like food, but very often it is symbolic. It may be anger about a person, a situation, or something that was said. For example, someone may feel deeply upset about a family member, a partner, a colleague, a teacher, or even a doctor. They may be angry about a work situation, a school situation, breakup, betrayal, or an unfair decision from an authority. Sometimes it is a remark or news that feels like too much, accusations, criticism, insults, or shocking information that feels hard to swallow or too much to digest. All indigestible morsel conflicts belong to tissues that come from the endoderm. This is the oldest embryonic germ layer. These tissues are controlled by brainstem cells. In the moment a person experiences a DHS, known as the conflict shock, it instantly creates a Hammer focus. The image on the left shows the brainstem with all the little yellow dots. These are related to different conflicts in specific relays. The one at the top, right in the center, appears in the brainstem area that corresponds to the small intestine. On a non-contrast CT scan, this is described as a ring-like pattern. That brain relay is connected to the small intestine on the organ level, so whatever is happening in the person's emotional world is mirrored in both the brain and the tissue. The biological function of the small intestine is to digest and absorb nutrients, especially proteins and the morsels of life that nourish us. When someone feels that something is emotionally or situationally indigestible, then the body responds by starting a special biological program in the small intestine. The purpose is not to harm the person, but to help them cope. The program is interpreted as an attempt to increase the efficiency of digestion and absorption of nutrients in order to deal with what feels like too much to handle. In other words, the body is trying to work harder to break down and process the emotional morsels that the psyche cannot yet integrate. It is the body's way of adapting to a painful or shocking experience that has not yet been resolved. The small intestine is simply doing its best to help the person digest what they could not accept at the time, both literally and symbolically. Once the conflict is recognized, felt through, and resolved, the biological program may shift into healing and the tissue changes start to gradually normalize. Once the DHS has occurred and the person is in the conflict active phase, the small intestine is no longer in its normal resting rhythm. From this perspective, the body responds to the indigestible morsel conflict by increasing the number of intestinal cells in the area that corresponds to the conflict. The intensity and duration of the conflict influence how strong this cellular response is. The idea is that if the person feels unable to digest or take in something on an emotional level, the biology tries to compensate by literally building more tissue to digest and absorb more efficiently. It is seen as the body saying, "Let me create more surface and more function so I can handle this morsel." As the conflict continues, this cell growth may show up as a flat thickening along the wall of the small intestine, especially in the jejunum. This is sometimes described as an absorptive type growth because the focus is on increasing the area that can absorb nutrients. Toward the end of the small intestine, in the ileum, the wall is thinner and more delicate. In that region, the same biological program can lead to a more cauliflower-shaped growth, often called a secretory type, because it is associated with increased secretion and activity. From a GHK perspective, both patterns are part of the same adaptive program. They are just different forms the extra tissue can take, depending on the location and intensity of the conflict. If this process continues for a long time and the growth becomes extensive, it may start to interfere with the passage of intestinal contents. This can lead to a partial or complete bowel obstruction, sometimes called an ileus when it involves the distal ileum. In conventional medicine, when doctors see this thickening of the intestinal wall or these masses on imaging and during endoscopy, they interpret it through the standard model and may diagnose it as jejunal cancer or ileal cancer. From a GHK perspective, the same finding is interpreted as conflict active tissue growth with a biological purpose to improve digestion of what was perceived as indigestible until the underlying conflict is resolved and the program can move into its healing phase.
The healing phase and symptoms. Once the conflict is finally resolved, this is what we call the conflict resolution or conflictolysis. This is when the body shifts gears from survival mode into repair. The small intestines no longer needs the extra cells it builds during the conflict active phase, so the biology starts to clean up the restoring normal tissue. In this model, fungi and mycobacteria such as tuberculosis bacteria play a key role in that cleanup. Their job is to break down and remove the cells that are no longer needed, like a biological demolition crew clearing away temporary structures that have served their purpose. As this healing phase unfolds, we start to see symptoms. If the duodenum, the upper part of the small intestine, is involved, healing may show up as diarrhea or vomiting. This is not the body failing, but the body actively flushing and repairing the tissue. People may also experience night sweats, which are interpreted as another sign that the body is working hard in the healing phase, breaking down tissue and processing debris. The intestines can become swollen and sensitive while this is all happening, and as the swelling peaks and then discharges. When fungi are especially involved, this regenerative process may show up as what conventional medicine calls intestinal candida. Instead of seeing candida as just an overgrowth that needs to be attacked, as part of a biological repair team, helping to decompose surplus tissue created during the conflict active phase. How strong or dramatic the healing phase feels depends on how intense and how long the original conflict was. A long, highly charged conflict will likely result in more tissue change, which then means more noticeable healing symptoms when the body finally does repair. A shorter, milder conflict may produce lighter, more manageable symptoms. The epicrisis. The epicrisis or epileptoid crisis is the peak discharge point of the healing phase, a short, intense push that the body uses to complete this repair process. During healing, the affected tissue becomes swollen, filled with edema and repair fluid, as all healing occurs in a fluid environment and its function is temporarily altered. The epicrisis is the moment when the organism briefly switches back into a high-tone, stress-light state in order to finally squeeze out the edema and the repair fluid from the tissue. This also restores normal tone and movement, and for the gut, this means strong peristaltic waves and possible colicky cramps. This resets the autonomic nervous system, discharging the accumulated charge from the conflict and the repair work. It often feels like a sudden worsening, and for the small intestines, this can be a gripping abdominal cramps or one very intense evacuation. This is so important to know that this is not a setback. It is the built-in turning point the body uses to push the healing process over its peak, to transition from the wet, watery, swollen repair tissue towards normalization and scarification. Signal that the program is moving toward completion rather than escalation. In other words, the epicrisis is considered necessary because without this brief concentrated discharge, the system would remain stuck in a soggy, low-tone healing state. The epicrisis is the body's way of saying, I've done enough repair, now I need one strong push to clear the way and reset.
When we experience a shock or DHS and our psyche registers this as a threat, it will go into protection mode in order to prevent us from feeling that shock again. If the psyche perceived gluten as a threat because that is what was in the person's psyche, every time that person eats it, their body runs the special biological program in order to protect him or her. But this doesn't just apply to gluten. It can be berries, dairy, or literally anything that the psyche picked up at the time of the DHS. Let's look at a common real-life example. This boy is running the same special biological program, but this time, instead of gluten, it's dairy. A boy goes off to overnight camp where he is away from his parents for a few weeks. The now 49-year-old man describes the first 2 weeks there as hell. The boy is forced to drink milk against his will. Due to this, he partly refused to eat, which equals the conflict of not being able to digest something. Digestible anger conflict with an aspect of starvation. His trigger was drinking milk. At home, he normally never drinks milk. For 43 years, the patient has suffered from diarrhea whenever he had consumed milk or milk products unknowingly. The recurring conflict was due to a milk trigger. When he became familiar with the 5 biological laws of nature and understood the connection, the conflict immediately resolved. Since then, the patient can drink a lot of milk without any issue. In everyday life, there are several reasons someone might have diarrhea, and not all of them fit the indigestible morsel conflict pattern. The most straightforward explanation is simple. Sometimes we eat something that doesn't agree with us. Spoiled food or a sudden change in diet can all irritate the gut and lead to loose stools. So the first step is always to consider whether the food itself might be the cause. From a GHK perspective, if you can reasonably rule out bad food as the trigger, then diarrhea may be seen in a different light. In the context of an indigestible morsel conflict, loose bowel movements are understood as a sign of healing. The idea is that once the conflict has been resolved, once the person has finally let go or come to terms with what felt so hard to digest, the body shifts into repair. Diarrhea in this lens is the intestine actively eliminating what it no longer needs, both physically and symbolically. It is the body saying, I'm done holding on to this. This kind of diarrhea is associated with the healing phase, vagatonia, when the system is in rest and repair mode and is clearing out the remnants of the earlier biological program. There is another very different pattern as well. Diarrhea can also appear suddenly in moments of acute anxiety or fear, when the nervous system is in high alert, sympathetic mode, or fight or flight. In this situation, chemicals and stress hormones are released that affect the digestive tract, speeding everything up and resulting in loose stools. From a biological standpoint, this makes sense. It is much easier for an animal to fight or flee with an empty gut. In this case, the diarrhea is not linked to a long-running indigestible morsel conflict or a healing phase, but to a short-term stress response in the moment.
The large intestine versus the small intestine. When we look at the small intestine from a GHK perspective, the core theme is, I cannot absorb or make use of this morsel. The small intestine is about taking in, breaking down, and extracting what is valuable. On a conflict level, this often shows up as a feeling like there is not enough of something essential, or that what is available cannot be used or integrated. It can relate to food, of course, but also to love, attention, money, opportunities, or support. The flavor is often frustration, worry, or anger about not being able to get what I need or make this work in a practical way. Biologically, the tissue proliferates in the conflict active phase to increase the surface area and capacity to extract more from the morsel. In healing, as the extra cells are broken down, we experience cramping, diarrhea, night sweats, and fatigue. With the large intestine in the colon, the theme shifts to this is dirty, shitty, morsel that I need to get rid of. Here the focus is no longer on absorbing but on eliminating and separating from what it no longer wanted. These conflicts often involve situations, people, or events that feel disgusting, unfair, humiliating, or morally dirty. The person may feel, I cannot believe I have to deal with this, or I just want this out of my life. In the conflict active phase, there is cell growth to help separate and push out this unwanted morsel more efficiently. In the healing phase, as those cells are removed, there can be pain, mucus, blood, urgency, and changes in the stool that conventional medicine may label as colitis, polyps, or colon inflammation. One key distinction is that the small intestine is about not being able to take in and use enough, while the large intestine is about needing to push away and let go of what feels dirty or intolerable.
The BioSwitch program is the part of this work that really focuses on the subconscious. Just as we can switch a special biological program on, we can also switch it off. In GHK terms, that switch is the DHS. It is the moment of an acute, unexpected, isolating shock when your biology started a special biological program to help you survive what your psyche perceived as a threat. In that instant, your subconscious recorded not only what happened emotionally, but also everything around you associated with your sensory organs. This includes foods, smells, places, people, even the time of year. Those details become tracts, and ever since then, every time you meet one of those tracts, your body quietly reacts as if the original emergency is happening again. The BioSwitch is a guided process that helps you go back safely to that original event, bring it into conscious awareness, and update the meaning your subconscious gave it. Instead of, I am still in danger, the nervous system learns, that was then, this is now. I survived, and this cannot harm me in the same way anymore. As that recognition lands, the emotional charge around the event softens, and the tracks begin to lose their power. The food, the place, the smell, the situation can remain in your life, but without the old alarm attached to it. In that sense, the same hidden experience that once turned the program on becomes the key that turns it off, and your biology no longer has to keep running the chronic pattern in order to protect you. In my situation, I actually knew what the original conflict was. My symptoms started right after the tragic news of my brother's death, so the timeline for me was very clear. Sometimes the subconscious mind buries these experiences so deeply that we cannot consciously remember them. But in my case, I could feel the connection. I just did not yet understand how gluten or fettuccine fit into the picture, or why my body was reacting the way it did. Working with Danny Carroll, I began to see that gluten had become a track attached to my brother's death. The pasta I was eating at the time was not just food anymore. On a subconscious level, it had been paired with the shock, the grief, and the feeling of being starved for his love because he was taken so suddenly and so young. Every time I ate gluten after that, my biology reacted as if it was reliving the moment of loss. It was not simply a gluten problem, it was my body's way of remembering and trying to protect me from that pain. Danny helped me gently separate those two things, the gluten and the memory of my brother. Through the bioswitch process, he guided me to see that gluten itself was neutral and that the meaning my subconscious had attached to it belonged to a specific moment in the past. He prepared a bioswitch prescription that allowed my nervous system to switch off gluten as a reminder of my brother's death. In other words, I disconnected the tract. Once that link was released, my body no longer needed to respond to gluten as if it were a signal of danger or loss, and that changed everything about how I experienced it. I was instructed to read this GHK prescription or mantra every night before bed and upon rising for 2 weeks. This was an amazing process because it shut off my special biological program literally like a light switch. Subconscious mind, I know you have recorded gluten as a reminder that I was starved of my brother's love when he very sadly died at a young age. I love gluten and I love my brother. My brother's memory is not gluten, and gluten is not my brother's memory. Separate those entities and remove gluten as a reminder or track to my brother's loss and my starvation for his love after he passed. I love gluten and want to keep enjoying eating gluten without it reminding me of my brother. Switch gluten off as a track or reminder of the loss of my brother. Thank you for joining us for this journey into further understanding digestive issues from a GHK perspective. We hope this information has helped you observe your symptoms in a new, meaningful way and provided practical tools to support your healing. If you would like to go deeper, you can explore more resources and courses on our website, including Introduction to Dr. Hammer's 5 Biological Laws, Living in Biological Harmony, Pregnancy and Female Reproduction, and Anxiety from a GHK perspective. We are honored to walk this path with you. Always remember, your biology is on your side and you are never alone.